Welcome you to this afternoon's panel discussion, sponsored by the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. I'm Lori Maffley-Kipp, a faculty member at the center and director of our Fellows program. I encourage you to take information available on your way out this evening about the center's broader enterprise, including our other upcoming public events. I also invite you to join our email list, to contact us with any questions or feedback, and to follow our online journal on religion and politics. As I hope most of you know by now, the center serves as a nonpartisan, research-oriented, public-minded venue for fostering rigorous scholarship and informing both academic and broader community audiences about the intersections of religion and U.S. politics. The center strives to promote sustained engagement with the religious and political debates shaping American life now and in the past. Our program today also highlights one of the signal features of the mission of the Danforth Center, our Fellows program. The center sponsors two programs for visiting early career scholars, one for doctoral candidates in their final year of research and writing, and the other for postdoctoral scholars in the early stages of their careers. It is through these residential programs that we enrich the variety of approaches we bring to our research and teaching by gathering and supporting outstanding younger scholars. Our moderator today is one of our current fellows, Lauren Turek, and we feel very fortunate to have had her in residence with us this year. Lauren is a doctoral candidate in the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. She specializes in the history of U.S. foreign relations, politics, and 20th century American evangelicalism. Her dissertation, entitled "To Bring the Good News to All Nations, Evangelicals, Human Rights, and U.S. Foreign Policy, 1969 to 1994, explores the complex and deeply significant ways in which religion and religious groups interacted with foreign policy, political culture, and the international human rights regime to shape America's role in the modern world. And in August, Lauren will join the history department at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, as an assistant professor. Before I turn the podium over to Lauren so that she can introduce our speakers, I take this opportunity to issue two reminders. First, please turn off or otherwise silence your cell phones. Second, please join us for a reception after this event right outside the doors where we can continue the conversation. Lauren.
Thank you, Lori, for the introduction, and thank you all so much for being here for today's event. Before I introduce our panelists, I also want to thank Sherry Pena, Deborah Kennard, Rachel Lindsay, and Lori Maffley-Kipp for all of the help in organizing this event, and to thank everybody at the center for making this year a really wonderful experience for me. So we're very lucky to have with us today three distinguished scholars of history, politics, and international law. They will be drawing on their academic scholarship and, in some cases, their policy experience to discuss the relationship between international human rights, religious freedom, and U.S. foreign policy. To provide some recent historical context, I'll note that in 1998, the United States Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act, a piece of legislation intended to make the promotion of religious freedom and advocacy for individuals facing persecution for their religious beliefs a key objective of U.S. foreign policy. The act established the Office of International Religious Freedom at the State Department, an independent commission on international religious freedom, and a special advisor to the National Security Council. Almost 20 years have passed now since that act went into effect. What I'm hoping for us to consider today, and what I'm hoping our panelists will speak on, is how incorporating these protections for religious freedom into the matrix of foreign policy making has shaped the way that the United States engages with other nations. Approaching this general question from an interdisciplinary perspective should allow for a lively discussion of historical trends as well as present-day challenges. So let me now introduce our panelists. Our first speaker will be Dr. William Inboden, who's Executive Director of the William P. Clements Jr. Center for History, Strategy, and Statecraft at the University of Texas, Austin. He serves as Associate Professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and is a Distinguished Scholar at the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law. Dr. Inboden's other current roles include non-residential fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the United States and associate scholar with Georgetown University's Religious Freedom Project. Previously, he served as senior director for strategic planning on the National Security Council at the White House, where he worked on a range of foreign policy issues, including the national security strategy, democracy and governance, and multicultural institutions and initiatives. Dr. Inboden also worked at the Department of State as a member of the policy planning staff and special advisor in the Office of International Religious Freedom, and has worked as a staff member in both the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. Dr. Inboden is a contributing editor to Foreign Policy magazine, and his commentary has appeared in numerous media outlets, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. He is the author of Religion and American Foreign Policy, 1945 to 1960, The Soul of Containment, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. Dr. Elizabeth Hurd is Associate Professor of Political Science and holds a courtesy appointment in Religious Studies at Northwestern University. Dr. Hurd is the author of The Politics of Secularism in International Relations and Beyond Religious Freedom, The New Global Politics of Religion, as well as numerous articles. She is co-editor of Politics of Religious Freedom, a symposium on rethinking religious freedom in the Journal of Law and Religion, and Comparative Secularisms in a Global Age. Dr. Hurd is also an organizer of the Politics of Religious Freedom, Contested Norms, and Local Practice project. She consults on academic, media, and foundation projects involving religion and international affairs, and has co-edited a series on the politics of religious freedom on the imminent frame. At Northwestern, Dr. Hurd directs a graduate certificate program in religion and global politics and is a core faculty member of the program in Middle East and North African Studies. She is also the chair of the Religion and Politics section of the American Political Science Association. Professor Leila Sadat is an internationally recognized human rights expert specializing in international criminal law and justice. The Henry H. Oberschelp Professor of Law at Washington University School of Law and director of the Whitney R. Harris World Law Institute since 2007, she has published more than 90 books and articles in leading journals and academic presses throughout the world. She is currently serving as an Israel Treiman Faculty Fellow at Washington University Law School, and in December 2012, International Criminal Court Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda appointed her as a special advisor on crimes against humanity. Earlier that year, she was elected to membership in the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations. And in 2011, she was awarded the Alexis de Tocqueville Distinguished Fulbright Chair in Paris, France, the first woman to receive such an honor. In 2008, she launched the Crimes Against Humanity Initiative, an international effort to study the problem of crimes against humanity and draft a global treaty addressing their punishment and prevention. The draft treaty is now available in 7 languages and is currently being debated by the UN International Law Commission and governments around the world. From 2001 to 2003, Professor Sadat served on the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom. Each panelist today will speak for approximately 15 minutes, after which I will offer some brief comments, and then we'll have a chance to respond. And we'll be sure to leave about a half an hour at the end for questions from the audience. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists. Again, we're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Lauren, for putting on this panel. I was very excited to get the invitation. And I'll say here, Lauren's too humble to draw attention to herself, but she has a really outstanding dissertation project she's finishing up and a very promising academic career ahead of her. Soon going to be moving down the road from us in San Antonio, Texas to take up a position at Trinity, so congratulations on that. And I think she represents the best of so much what the Danforth Center is about, not only very sophisticated scholarship at high levels, but also identifying new scholarly talent and bringing it here for a time and then giving it a great boost forward. So it's an honor to be a part of that. And thanks again, especially to Lori and Lee and Marie for having me back here. I should start by noting, when I mentioned having me back here, my first visit to Danforth Center was in late October 2011. And the Danforth Center was relatively new at the time. I was honored to be invited here. I gave a lecture on Reinhold Niebuhr. And I'll just note that the same evening I was here, the Cardinals won Game 6 of the World Series on the way to winning Game 7 the next night. Now, I'm just a simple historian. We don't deal with complex models of causation or correlation. I'll leave that to the political scientists like Dr. Hurd. But perhaps my return visit bodes well for the upcoming season. Anyway, all right. More serious matters at hand. I will be speaking in a somewhat bifurcated role here today. Part of my remarks will be in my capacity as a historian who has looked at the role of religion and religious freedom policy somewhat in the history of American foreign policy and America's engagement with the world. I'll offer some broad brush reflections on that. Then I will switch and speak in my role as a recovering policymaker. As you heard from Lauren, I, in a previous life, spent a number of years in Washington in different foreign policy positions, including working on religious freedom policy, and was one of the staff authors of the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998. And I'll then offer some reflections from the policy role, particularly kind of what it was like working on that law, what some of the impressions and misimpressions that came away, and a couple closing reflections on what it might mean today. So first, religious freedom promotion in American diplomatic history. It strikes me, looking at moments in our nation's past when American policymakers have engaged in efforts to alleviate religious persecution, promote religious freedom abroad, that it really seems to have coincided with America's emergence as a global power. To give a very broad brushstroke of American diplomatic history, for most of the 19th century, the United States was not isolationist, to be sure, had quite a bit of interaction with other nations, but our main preoccupations as a middling, rising power were with consolidating control and security on the continent, and getting our own governing house in order. And then it was the conventional history, which I generally buy, is that in 1898 marked the emergence of the United States as a rising global power with the Spanish-American War, America's acquisition of colonial possessions, et cetera, first under McKinley and then under President Teddy Roosevelt. And that was really a hinge point in American diplomatic history. That also marks the first significant time, I think, that American policymakers started paying attention to religious freedom and religious persecution concerns overseas. And so there's very interesting threads to trace there. So looking over the last 115, 120 years or so, it seems to me there are three phases that cascade upon each other and draw upon each other in America's promotion of religious freedom abroad. The first one I would call episodic idealism, and that runs roughly from 1903 up till 1941. And by episodic, it means that there was not a consistent, high-level, systemic policy of promoting religious freedom, but rather when American presidents would become aware of religious persecution or religious freedom concerns abroad, and it would seize their attention, whether because of domestic constituencies or matters of conscience, they would do what they could to address it. So a signature moment came in 1903 when Teddy Roosevelt was president, and American Jewish leaders and American Christian leaders came and shared with him their grief over the Kishinev pogroms in Russia. In the town of Kishinev, there was essentially state-sponsored persecution of Jews there. A number were killed, others being horribly mistreated, homes burned, etc. At the time in the discourse of international politics, state sovereignty was seen to be sacred, really, inviolable, and nations did not talk to other nations about internal matters, if you will. But President Roosevelt was, for a number of complicated reasons, was very concerned about these reports from Kishinev, and so he sent a diplomatic note to Tsar Nicholas saying, "Please stop mistreating the Jews. Stop these pogroms." And such things are commonplace in diplomacy these days, but at the time it was arguably a watershed moment. I mean, one scholar has said with that, the international human rights movement was born. That's hyperbole. I wouldn't go that far, but it was significant. But such deviations from precedent for matters of conscience were completely unusual for Roosevelt. In the domestic context, 2 years earlier, he'd been the first U.S. president to invite an African American to the White House when he invited Booker T. Washington for dinner. Another example comes from Woodrow Wilson, who in addition to his fervent negotiations for the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles with the settlement at the end of World War I, also made religious freedom a priority in a number of dimensions, such as when he was talking to the leaders of the then new nation of Poland about the drafting of their constitution, encouraged them to adopt religious freedom protections, as well as other states arising out of the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, also episodically engaged in religious freedom promotion. For example, when he became president in 1933, he had decided to extend diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union, which had been previously diplomatically ostracized after the Communist Revolution in 1917, ostracized by the United States. But he put a number of conditions on this diplomatic recognition, primarily Moscow's willingness to at least grant religious freedom protections to Americans who were residing in the Soviet Union, diplomats and business leaders and others. And this was an engagement that he kept up with in his ongoing dialogue with the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. So those are just examples, but I think they're examples that illustrate the point about these engagements in religious freedom promotion were episodic. You know, there was not an office at the State Department doing this. There was not a law mandating it. Rather, when American presidents would become aware of these issues and thought that they might be able to do something, they would integrate it into their diplomacy. Phase two, which I trace from 1941 to roughly 75, I would call principled institutionalism, or institutionalizing principles, if you will. And this is where the diplomatic concern for religious freedom goes from just these sporadic cases to now, can we talk about these things in more universal ways? Why do I date it from 1941? Because that's when, in January of 41, FDR gives his Four Freedoms speech. And one of which, of course, one of the four freedoms, of course, is the freedom of worship. And he made clear that, as he said over and over again, not just for the United States, but for the entire world. So very lofty aspirations there. One might say it was mere rhetoric, but I think one can trace, from the Four Freedoms to the Atlantic Charter later that year, which Dr. Borgward, of course, has written very eloquently on up through the UN Charter and the Universal, in 1945, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. So FDR's vision of a post-war world, he starts laying out with the Four Freedoms speech, and that includes religious freedom. And so the idea is to take some of these principles, and including the principle of religious freedom, and see if they can be institutionalized internationally. Hence the institutionalization in the United Nations. And this. I trace this up to 1975 because that's when we have the adoption of the Helsinki Accords, which also include fairly robust protections of religious freedom. So again, continuing this effort at institutionalizing in international bodies religious freedom concerns. So then the third phase, which I would trace from roughly 1973 up through 1998, would be policy institutionalization. And this is where the effort goes to now create in the American government system and the American government in the American policy apparatus promotion of religious freedom. So I started with 1973, and you can see there's some overlap here. So post 1941, it doesn't mean that American presidents aren't also engaging in episodic concern with cases of religious persecution or bilateral diplomacy, and just as post 75 doesn't mean that there is no more efforts at international institutionalization. So think of these things as three layers building upon each other. But in 1973 is of course the passage of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment from Senator Scoop Jackson and Congressman Charles Vanik, particularly concerned with the rights of immigration of Soviet Jews, but also comes out of a larger set of human rights concerns. But what this does is it's a pretty significant piece of human rights legislation that then creates a sort of an ongoing policy apparatus in American law, saying that we won't be trading with countries if they are not allowing at least some protections to mistreated or persecuted religious minorities. And I trace that up through through 1998, because that, of course, is the passage of the International Religious Freedom Act, which represents a much more systemic and comprehensive effort to institutionalize this policy promotion. One could also point to the creation of the Human Rights Bureau and its growth at the State Department in the mid and late 70s, and some of these other institutionalization efforts. So thus ends my potted history, like I said, of the 3 phases of efforts to bring religious freedom promotion into American foreign policy. But I wanted to give that as a little bit of context because that was the milieu that we were operating in the late 1990s when I was a congressional staffer, and this campaign came about to draft and pass a religious freedom law of some sort. And as I mentioned, I had some role in this. I was just one of several staff and who worked on it, so I certainly won't take all the credit or all the blame for that matter, since there's plenty of criticisms to be made of the law. But when we were working on it, there was a sense, is this, that we were asking ourselves, how unprecedented is this? Is this something completely, ex nihilo, sui generis? Has this ever been done before? And as we looked into history, realized, well, there are some historical strains here. I mean, the very fact that this domestic coalition has risen up in American politics calling for the passage of a law tells us there's something here. But there also was a particular narrative of American history and America's role in the world that a lot of the backers of the law were drawing on. And I had tried to sketch that out there. But both at the time of the passage of the law and I think since then, there have been what I would say, if I could be provocative, and this is an academic context, why not be provocative, right? Were a number of myths that rose around the passage of the law itself. And I want to address those and then say what I think was the reality, at least at the time. The first myth would be that the law was an effort to impose the American First Amendment on the rest of the world. This was an accusation made at the time by a lot of opponents of the law, and the one that's still here sometimes. The United States has its First Amendment of free exercise and disestablishment. Works for us, but who are we to impose on the rest of the world? Well, at least in the drafting of the law, we were very self-conscious about trying to ground it in international law. So there's no mention even of the First Amendment, but rather Article 18 of the Universal Declaration, Article 18 of the ICCPR, and those explicit standards, because what we're trying to be very clear with the law is that this is not an effort to remake the world in America's image, but rather to incorporate into American foreign policy pre-existing and previously agreed upon for the last 60, 70 years by most countries in the world, standards for religious freedom, which in the particular can take any number of manifestations. The law certainly doesn't oppose state religions or anything like that, but rather it's concerned about at least protecting the freedom of belief and practice. The second, I think, myth is that the International Religious Freedom Act represented a sectarian agenda pushed by American evangelical Protestants. Now, it is a fact that a number of evangelical Protestant leaders and groups were supportive of the passage of a law. But what was much more interesting to me was there was a pretty broad multi-faith coalition that was aggressively pushing for the law, and then a number of secular non-religious human rights groups as well. And even pretty jaded congressional staff who'd been around the block quite a few times. I thought they'd seen every last legislative coalition come together they could was baffled by this one. So the Baha'is, the Tibetan Buddhists, the Uyghur Muslim representatives, a number of the Jewish groups, the Catholics, the evangelical groups, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Human Rights First, were all quite supportive of the law and marshaled their backers behind it to lobby Congress, et cetera. Now, a number of them had different emphases in the law. A number of them had different areas of priority. Some of them differed with particular aspects of it. But it was quite a broad coalition that pushed the law. The main opposition to the law came from the business community, who was concerned about the sanctions provisions in it. So. Now, a third distinct but related myth is that the law was an effort to promote evangelical missionary efforts around the world. Now, and here's where there's a much less appreciated fact, which was very curious to me at the time, continues to be so. Most evangelical Protestant missionary groups actually opposed the law and tried to stop it. And they had a couple of very specific concerns. They also didn't have political mobilization arms. And this is where, if you delve into the infinite complexities of American evangelicalism, you realize that there's some groups, the erstwhile Christian Coalition, the Family Research Council, et cetera, who are much more concerned with domestic politics. And then the missionary organizations are concerned with their missionary efforts. And the missionary groups are politically pretty impotent. They're not used to lobbying Congress. But what they did is they started sending a lot of messages to a number of staff who are working on law saying, don't pass this thing, or if you do, please change a number of provisions. Their big overriding concern was just politicization. They felt like they had very sensitive, they were doing very sensitive work in a lot of sensitive and closed countries, and they did not want American foreign policy paying any attention to them. And they worried that if a law was passed which would be promoting religious freedom efforts and getting the State Department involved in this, that it could make their own work very precarious. But they also had another very particular concern of some of the immigration provisions in law. So the law had some immigration provisions designed to make it easier for people who had been suffering religious persecution to receive asylum in the United States, okay, essentially as refugees. Well, a lot of the missionary groups were worried that, look, we've been in X or Y country for 100 years, and we finally have one little church going with 50 Christians in this otherwise overwhelmingly Muslim country, and now all 50 of them are going to emigrate to the United States because of this law, and it'll reverse the Great Commission, was the concern we heard. Anyway, so that again, it's a myth that the evangelical missionary groups were pushing the law, and it was supposed to be a stalking horse for them. If anything, they actually opposed it. And then I think the fourth myth is that the International Religious Freedom Act represented a kind of a hijacking or a distortion or a profound new direction for American foreign policy. Or elevated religious freedom to a much more significant human rights. It created a hierarchy of human rights. My take, and I don't mean this to sound too cynical, is it's not been a very effective law. American attention to religious freedom before the law was passed was kind of episodic. I gave you some of the examples. And American foreign policy attention to religious freedom since the law has been kind of episodic. The Religious Freedom Office is buried in the bureaucratic bowels of the State Department, and it just really hasn't been all that effective. So it certainly has not met the lofty ideals and hopes of its many firm proponents, and certainly has not rewarded the massive resources devoted to its passage. But I also don't think that it's become the horribly malicious distortion of American foreign policy that some critics had also feared. So many other things that could be said, but I've already used up my allotted time, and I'm sure there'll be a lot to talk about in discussion. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lauren, for the invitation to be here. It's my first visit to the Danforth Center. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk, and I know we don't have much time, so I'm going to talk just for a little while about my work on the politics of religion and religious freedom, and develop just 3 quick takeaway points that I'll point out as I run along. Now, as you know, in the U.S., religious freedom is often described as the first freedom. Americans, we're told, invented it and we're exporting it, and we've heard about how the U.S. is promoting religious freedom as a foreign policy objective. Legal guarantees of religious freedom are appearing all over now, not just in the U.S., but all over the world increasingly. Diplomats are being instructed in how to persuade their counterparts on how to safeguard religious freedom, and foreign policy establishments are formalizing its measurement and its promotion. There are many elaborate charts, maps, and models tracking its rise and fall across the world. One could easily conclude that religious freedom then is a stable, fundamental human right, legal standard, even a social fact that should be promoted globally, that it's very simple. Why shouldn't other citizens of other countries enjoy this privilege? And in that view, governments, of course, should be persuaded to comply with what we know is a universal standard. States and societies are seen as inclined either toward the achievement of religious freedom, as I said, something that can be measured, or as slipping backwards, as falling away into religious persecution driven by ancient hatreds or by rigid and intolerant theologies. We hear a lot about this today. So many scholars and religious freedom and human rights advocates, and much of the international media, though not everyone, has fallen more or less in line behind this account. And there's sort of been a chorus of voices insisting that religious freedom is something that will lead us to peace and prosperity. I work at the intersection of two fields in the study of global politics and the study of religion. So I work across the disciplines of political science and religious studies. And I'm really interested in how different understandings of religion are institutionalized by governments and by others. And I'm interested also in the ways in which expert knowledge about religion, including religion that's knowledge that's generated by academics, enables governments to undertake particular projects and forms of what I would call religious governance. And I would describe international religious freedom as one such project of governance. It's a project that has a lot of very complex and even contradictory effects in the world. It aspires to clarity and precision in what is inevitably a messy world. It positions itself as a curator rather than a component of cultural pluralism, as kind of above the fray. And it also aspires to create, it ends up creating boundaries between religions and between religion and non-religion. It's a very complex discourse. And so I've spent a few years studying this with some colleagues, and I've really found that in the case of the US, these very complex legal and political aspirations cannot be reduced to simply kind of the effects or the results of evangelical lobbying, which is something that is entirely a myth. I agree with that, or naked imperial ambition. It's a really complicated field, and I think we could say in some sense that international religious freedom has become the civilizing discourse of our time. So the first point I'd like you to take away to consider would be that there is no such thing as international religious freedom that is out there waiting to be implemented. It is an abstract norm that is always, like all norms, interpreted in particular times and places by particular authorities. So it's brought to life in different ways, different meanings, and different effects. In the case of the US, as we've heard, the US government has sought to institutionalize and then to globalize promotion and advocacy for what it understands to be a stable legal norm and standard. It's a norm that is understood to have a very special relationship to the American national project and to American exceptionalism, because the US, of course, is understood as the place where religion goes to become free. So we've heard a little bit about the 1998 legislation. I don't think I should review those were created. The State Department office was created. We've heard from people who've been on the inside of that process, so I'll move past that. And also just mention that that there's kind of an expanding religion bureaucracy in the US and elsewhere. And in 2013, there was another office created, which was called the Office of Faith-Based Community Initiatives, which was recently renamed the Office of Religion and Global Affairs. And that office was created to formalize relations between the US government and the global faith community and foreign religious leaders. The legislation, as you know, also created USCIRF, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which has been mentioned, and we will hear from someone who's served on that, so I won't spend much time on that. But I will say that there have been, it's also been mentioned, a number of legal challenges, USCIRF perhaps more than others targeted, including a lawsuit filed in 2012 claiming that USCIRF had discriminated in hiring on the basis of religion. This was a case where the commission was accused of discriminating in hiring practices against a Muslim American female attorney. This was reported by Michelle Borstein in the Post, saying that the allegations are the most explicit, Borstein said, in a years-long series of allegations that commission leaders are biased against Muslims, and specifically people associated with groups who are critical of U.S. foreign policy and who work for groups that fight anti-Muslim discrimination, end quote. So that lawsuit has not been resolved, and the USCIRF has been criticized for allegedly rescinding this job offer because the applicant was Muslim. As one journalist pointed out recently, this is an odd predicament for an entity charged with advocating for religious freedom. And I think that the religion bureaucracy raises a series of really important and interesting questions about the politics of religious establishment. And those are questions that I can't talk about here, but I talk about them in my book. To the extent that Americans are aware of this bureaucracy, and I think most probably aren't, if maybe they're not even interested, or the bureaucracy's buried away, as Will said, in some little corner. But to the extent that they are aware of it, it's kind of seen as normal or natural, and this is due to a very powerful coalescence, and we heard about this a moment ago, between universal human rights discourse on the one hand, and a very particular understanding of American history on the other, that posits the U.S. as the inventor of religious freedom, and the U.S. is exceptionally committed to religious freedom due to its unique history. And this combination, I think, reflects a very long-standing American prophetic tradition in which democracy and freedom and human rights are understood as absolutely essential to this moral project of America, to this project of redeeming the world in an important way of how we see ourselves. So we could say religious freedom, American style, is a language of reform and redemption and renewal. And I think it's important to situate this programming in a much longer history, a much longer series going, again, as we heard from our previous speaker, going back before 1998 and the act, in efforts by the United States to promote interests, strategic interests, economic interests, other interests, through social and religious engineering projects abroad. So during the Cold War, for example, the US sought to secure what it called global spiritual health through what was known as a, quote, religious offensive. And the US has for decades positioned itself as the guardian of global spirituality, as a place where, as I said, both religion and freedom go to become perfected. And there's a lot of people who support this project. It's very diverse constituencies and shifting coalitions, human rights advocates, advocacy groups for whom some form of Christianity serves as the foundation of human rights, American nationalists for whom the city on a hill narrative resonates strongly with ideals of American nationalism and exceptionalism and the sacralization of the American project itself, missionaries for whom religious liberalization signaled a unique kind of opening and an openness to missions that may not have existed previously, and of course partisans in the war on terror who have strongly taken up religious freedom as a disciplinary project to reform supposedly recalcitrant Muslims. So it's this combination of forces, very powerful forces, and not only evangelical lobbying, that propels the religious freedom lobby forward. To borrow a phrase from Paul Kennedy, religious freedom has captured the field of emancipatory possibility. I'm interested in projects in which the field of emancipatory possibility appears to have been captured. I find it disturbing and complex and perplexing and difficult, so I like to think about these questions. And I'm interested in the political work that's accomplished by that capturing of the field of emancipatory possibility. And I want to suggest that the privileging of religion in this way is motivating efforts by American and European governments, military establishments, development agencies, and this huge, expanding, growing overnight, every day we see someone else, religion bureaucracy. What they're doing is they're trying to secure equality and justice by recognizing religious people and religious communities in law and securing their rights. And what I argue in my new book is I try to figure out what's happening here from the perspective of the study of religion. So what we have here is measures and laws and initiatives that are adopting religion as a category that bring together people as corporate bodies, which then either as individuals or as corporate bodies are then seen as in need of legal protection to achieve their freedom. That's the idea. But the problem is that religion is extremely unstable. So whose religion is getting taken up and protected by which authorities and to what ends? And the crux of my argument, the crux of my concern, is to understand better the relationship between the religion that's provided for, that's protected, and a broader field of social and religious practices, histories, and experiences in which that mobilization occurs. And we can say what happens from the perspective of governance, but also from the perspective of everyday religious lives when religion is privileged in this way as a category of global governmental knowledge, action, and advocacy. So I'll mention two things and then I'll close. First of all, prioritizing it in this way as a foreign policy objective singles out individuals and groups for protection as religions. So people are defined and described in religious terms. It's kind of obvious, and not on social class, not based on historical ties or neighborhood or their employer or generational ties or which sports team they like or other things that tie people together. So we have a situation in which we're positing religion as prior to these other affiliations, and therefore privileging religion, or whatever counts as religion in different contexts. And here's a tricky part and a second takeaway point for you to think about. What falls under the heading of religion is a very contested mashup of shifting families of beliefs, institutional forms, and fields of practice and experience. There is no religion or set of religions that's just sitting out there waiting to be protected. So when we legalize religious freedom, we forcibly distill this more complex field into something governable. It's not a conspiracy, it's just the way things work out. We squeeze this kind of shifting set of human goings-on into the mold of whatever the authorities in place, and it could be anybody. It could be the Chinese government or the US or the EU or somebody else, whoever they define as religions that merit protection. And that's the religion that gets sanctified or privileged. That's the religion that gets protected. So I have an example. I'm not sure I have time, but I'd like to just give one example to illustrate some of these complications. One of the objections I often hear, very rightfully so, I think, is, well, what if there is a religious element to discrimination or to persecution on the ground? In other words, what if these categories are already real? Isn't pressing for religious freedom the solution? And here I've spent some time thinking about the plight of the Rohingya people of Myanmar and what it might mean for outsiders to advocate for their religious freedom. So the Rohingya are a stateless people, and they're experiencing discrimination, which is very complex. It's ethnic, it's racial, it's economic, it's religious, it's national, it's post-colonial. And it's really difficult to say, for anyone to say, which of these factors is causing the violence in any particular set of discriminatory actions. So when you, sir, for the media or the international community or scholars like me, when we describe the Rohingya as persecuted Muslims or as a religious minority that's in search of their religious freedom, religion becomes singled out as the most salient variable from what's in fact this very complex web of historical and contemporary discriminatory forces. Now, the point I want to make here is that many of these forces are entangled with religion, but they're not reducible to religion. And I think this is a crucial distinction. We're often told the Rohingya's lives are miserable because they're Muslim, and Burmese people don't like Muslims. It's religious intolerance that's motivating the violence, and the solution is religious freedom. So then the question is, why not represent them as Muslims who are discriminated against and then protect them as Muslims legally? Well, because to represent the Rohingya as Muslims, above all else, reinforces in this very specific context, in this very specific time and place, the political project of a violent, exclusionary Buddhist nationalist monks organization, which is called 969. This is a national movement that's very loosely organized that calls for the comprehensive exclusion of the Rohingya from Burmese state and Burmese society. It's pretty simple. They rely on hard and fast lines. You're either Muslim or you're Buddhist, strong connections between Buddhist religion, race, and nationalism. And to counter this exclusionary, religionized, and racialized form of nationalism, which is quite a monster these days, the Rohingya need to be included as humans in Burmese society, not as Muslims. And outside advocacy, I want to suggest, for their religious rights and freedoms may actually hinder such attempts. Incidentally, and very consequentially, although I won't have time to go into it here, it also leaves non-Muslim Rohingya, as well as those Rohingya who may prefer not to identify or speak as Muslims for whatever reason, completely voiceless. So we have a really complicated picture when we posit these religious identities and communities as the defining features on a landscape. We lend authority and authenticity to groups designated as religions. So we confer agency and community upon religions and religious divides and religious secular divides. At a meeting on religion and foreign policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, I heard John Campbell, the former U.S. ambassador, give a very interesting talk about the causes of recent violence in Nigeria, and I just want to read one quote from his talk. He said he wanted to warn the audience to not fall prey to the temptation of describing the violence in Nigeria as religious in nature, and he said, quote, "Are people in Nigeria being killed because they're Muslim, herders, or Hausa? It is often very hard to say," end quote. So now we can ask as well, are the Rohingya being killed in Myanmar because of their religion, or because they're depicted as immigrants and outsiders, or because they're perceived as threatening the political and economic interests of the former junta, or all of the above, perhaps? It's hard to say. And there's evidence that suggests that the former junta may in fact be supporting this religious persecution narrative as a means of displacing attention from their own complicity and culpability in casting out the Rohingya from the society. So, the second thing that I would point to here is privileging religious freedom from the perspective of the study of religion is that it really also shapes religious possibilities to do this. So we end up protecting groups as faith communities that have leaders and they have cleanly defined boundaries and clear orthodoxies. And these are the traditions then and the leaders that become the objects of what we now call religious engagement, or sometimes people call it faith-based diplomacy or religious outreach. There's a lot of different terms going around. So on a collective level, on a group level, this favors these clear authority structures because, of course, you got to have your spokesman take me to your imam. You have to have an official leader to represent the faith community to the government, to the NGO, to the international organization. So groups have to define themselves as a religion. You got to look like a religion. So failure to do so means you're not invited to the faith-based table. On an individual level, there's an imperative to define your identity in religious terms. Are you this or are you that? If you have more than one, you don't really know, you have mixed backgrounds, you dissent from the Orthodox or recognized religions, you're either out of the game or you're classified as a non-believer, a special category, a very complex one. I won't talk about that here, but it's interesting. So being caught in this position puts one in a difficult spot on a faith-based playing field or landscape. Either you got to make your political claims on recognizably religious grounds, or you have no ground from which to speak. And I think whether it's in Brazil or South Sudan or the US or Japan or Italy or anywhere really, religious studies scholars have shown that it's pretty difficult to classify people once and for all as believers or non-believers in a single tradition. And regimes of religious freedom and engagement and outreach, no problem, that elicit these identities are kind of forcing people to do this, and they're kind of constricting spaces So privileging religious freedom in foreign policy inevitably, I would suggest, creates a divide. And that's a divide between official, elite, and sanctioned religion and the rest of the world's religion, including practices that may be considered sacred by some people but don't even count as religion. So, decision makers and many scholars in the US and elsewhere push back very hard against this claim, you might imagine. They insist that their work is neutral, constitutional, and that not to pursue this new form of religious establishment would exclude important voices. My work tells a very different story, and that brings us to the third and final, since I'm almost out of time, takeaway point. The lived realities of contemporary religion and the lived realities of global politics, which are mixed up in each other and entangled in all kinds of fascinating ways, give us reason to question the claims of those who naively celebrate what's been called the return of religion to American foreign policy. Religious groups that the US disfavors are more likely to be classified as cults or extremists, while groups that the US likes, just the fact is, are going to be registered and protected as tolerant and orthodox. And this isn't something that can be fixed with a better understanding of religion or by bringing in 3 more religious groups to diversify. It's endemic to this project. And I'll conclude by saying that it's a very, very big project today. I think I'll probably skip over some of the examples, but I can talk in the Q&A if you're interested in hearing about what the Europeans or others are doing. The European Parliament has a working group. Everyone's promoting religious freedom. And when these authorities do this, when we govern through something called religious freedom, they have to decide which religions are protected and how, and which individuals and communities have which rights enshrined in law. And states and the advocates who want to mobilize those rights have to determine what counts as a legitimate religious practice, right, or community, and then grant that special status. And we see this in Indiana right now. Political space is becoming shaped by majoritarian state-sponsored religious distinctions. So neither religions nor religious actors are singular forces that can be quantified, engaged, celebrated, or condemned and divided between good and bad. And I think to rely for policy on the category of a religious actor presumes a certain form of actorship that's a political move. And there is no agreement within religious traditions on who speaks on behalf of a tradition, who's in and who's out, which texts and practices offer the core, represent the core of it, and so on. There is no single Judaism or Christianity. And I'm on the very end here. Let me just say that I think today we have in the US something we might want to call a religion industrial complex, where we have a lot of scholars who are working at the intersection of law and religion and global politics, and they're seeing no way forward but to take their place in this flourishing international infrastructure of religion and development, religion and constitutionalism, and religion and emergency aid, and there's a lot of pressure and financial incentives to sign on to these projects. And I think that this is something that's also a story of where resources come from in the neoliberal university. That's an interesting topic to think about that I won't go into here. So, as I said, people insist on the neutrality and the necessity of these efforts, and they may indeed be constitutional, as some scholars have argued very convincingly recently. But I think the questions we need to ask to wrap up here is, the law too has its limits. We can't stop there. We have to look into what's going on here. And I think the global religion agenda is ensuring that powerful forces, including the law itself, are incentivizing people to frame their claims for justice and equality in the language of religious rights and freedoms. And some people might feel they have no alternative. So this is creating new forms of religious agency. And in some cases, old hierarchies are being reasserted. And certain voices, including those who don't choose to speak in a religious register, are silenced. And I think the return of religion is proving to be a lot more complex and perhaps more troubling than some may have anticipated. So thank you so much.
Well, let me add my voice to the chorus, thanking Lauren and the Danforth Center for this very interesting opportunity to speak about an issue that I had the opportunity to work on as a practical matter for 2.5 years when I served as a member of USERF. What I'd like to do, and I should say I speak from the perspective of the international lawyer, so lawyers are practical people, and I will speak, I think, from a practical perspective, if that's all right. We like texts, and we like clarity. So I'd like to divide my presentation into three basic parts. First, to talk a little bit more about what we might mean by religious freedom, because we haven't actually really talked about the law. Second, to talk a little bit more about the United States and its efforts as part of USERF. What is USERF? I sat on USERF. I might venture a couple of stories, although obviously I speak completely in my personal capacity today. And finally, to talk about some of the problems of using religious freedom. There are some benefits to using religious freedom as part of your global advocacy on human rights, and there are obviously some downsides about which you've heard a little bit already from Elizabeth. So religious freedom is one of the fundamental freedoms that's addressed in the group of international human rights instruments that we look to that were developed after the founding of the United Nations in 45 and 46. Religious freedom recognizes, if you like, a powerful connection between human dignity and world peace and stability. International law has addressed this problem in many ways. First, most of the world's nations have committed themselves to the provisions of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Those are rights-based instruments. They recognize the right of each individual to worship or not as he or she sees fit. Article 18 of the Universal Declaration provides, and I quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes the freedom to change his religion or belief, either alone or in community with others, and in public or in private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance." There's also a little clause that says governments can regulate this right under certain circumstances. The Universal Declaration was adopted in 1948. There were no negative votes, although there were 8 abstentions. Because the Declaration is technically non-binding, although international lawyers would say it's part of customary international law, there were 2 covenants that were adopted to implement the Declaration: the ICCPR, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Article 18 of the ICCPR, the Civil and Political Rights Covenant, also has a religious freedom provision, very similar but longer than the provision in the Universal Declaration, because it was meant to be implemented by the states party to the covenant. The United States is a party to the covenant. About 150, 160 countries now are parties. It's widely ratified and widely accepted as part of the corpus, not just of general treaty law, but customary international law. There are other international instruments that enshrine a right to religious freedom, and I use that religious freedom because, as you could hear from the definition, it's thought, conscience, and belief, and the right to not have a religion as well. The European Convention on Human Rights, the American Convention on Human Rights, all of these international human rights instruments contain a provision relating to religious freedom. They're also relevant to my work. They're actually international criminal law instruments that discuss the issue of religion. The Genocide Convention, for example, makes genocide based on religious grounds a crime under international law, and that, of course, dates back to the Holocaust, when the attempted extermination of European Jewry was considered to be a crime, prosecuted as crimes against humanity at Nuremberg. You also see this in the crimes against humanity provision at the International Criminal Court. And in fact, many, if not most, I was thinking as Elizabeth was speaking, almost all of the situations the ICC prosecutor is dealing with right now have religion as an element of the case. So you have in Uganda the Lord's Resistance Army led by Joseph Kony. Now he's a self-proclaimed individual who has his own religion, but nonetheless he attacks people based on God telling him to do so, apparently. You have Boko Haram, you have the conflict in Nigeria, you have the conflict in the Central African Republic, you have the conflict in Sudan, virtually all of the 8 situations now in front of the court, and many of the cases under preliminary examination actually have a religious dimension. So while I agree with Elizabeth, and I'll come back to that, it can be dangerous to single out religion as the human right you're going to protect because there's so many other things in religion, and religious freedom is often embedded in other issues. There's no doubt that as the practical lawyer, it often gives you a very useful hook to get at a situation that's difficult to get at otherwise. Because to get at a situation, either in terms of human rights advocacy or in terms of criminal prosecution, if the situation is serious enough, you've got to have a written text that gives you that kind of a hook. And that's maybe why, we can talk about this in the Q&A, religious freedom has emerged, because it is terrifying to see ISIS go after Christians, Assyrians, and others. And immediately one thinks, can they actually be accused of genocide, which is the strongest international condemnation that we have in international law today. So I've actually written a piece on that, because the Genocide Convention is a powerful tool. It only covers 4 things, and religion is one of them. And I think that's why it's not so much is it the evangelicals or others, it's that these are tools that we have. Where human rights are threatened, we use the tools that we've got. So religious freedom has these rights, but the other part of religious freedom is tolerance. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of rights-based instruments on that, but we do have the Declaration on the Elimination on all forms of intolerance and discrimination based on religion and belief. And it provides that it's essential to promote understanding, tolerance, and respect in matters relating to freedom of religion or belief, and to ensure that the use of religion or belief for ends inconsistent with the Charter of the United Nations is inadmissible. So you have the rights on one hand, and you have a requirement of tolerance on the other. The principle of tolerance is maybe one of the most important principles. It's a necessary corollary to the peaceful exercise of one's own right. One can't exist really without the other. It's recently become apparent that religious freedom and religious tolerance are intimately connected to world order. In the absence of Cold War ideology, identity, or civilizational politics, I thought it was interesting that we mentioned religion as the new civilizing politics, but religion and religious conflict have come to the forefront of global politics in a negative and sometimes terrifying manner. And again, thinking of the situations in my own discipline, international criminal law, the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia, which really brought about the resurrection of the International Criminal Justice Project, was basically a conflict between 3 religious groups, even though it wasn't prosecuted as such before the ICTY, and that's an interesting story in and of itself. You had Bosnian Muslims, you had Croats who were Catholic, and you had Serbs who were Eastern Orthodox, and that was really the way the conflict disintegrated. I'm going to skip some of these, some of the other things I could say about sort of what's the legal landscape look with respect to religious freedom, and now go to USERF, because USERF was mentioned a couple of times. So as you already heard, in 1998, there was this concern about religious persecution abroad, and Congress adopted the International Religious Freedom Act, or IRFA, to ensure that the weight of American foreign policy was focused squarely behind the guarantees of the ICCPR and the Universal Declaration. The legislation that became IRFA was introduced by Congressman Frank Wolf on May 21st, 1997. I think some of the rationale for why you hear this was an evangelical project is because it was pretty clear that as initially proposed, the legislation really focused on Christian persecution. I served as a commissioner with Nina Shea, who had written a book called In the Lion's Den, which focused on Christian persecution around the world, and there was a sense that this was very much the issue as the day, but the bill as originally drafted ran into some fairly serious opposition, particularly from those who thought it focused too much on one religion. And also there were mandatory sanctions that were attached to the original legislation, which was thought to be too blunt an instrument, that there shouldn't be some automatic sanction if a finding of an abuse of religious freedom was found, but that there should be a more sort of nuanced and thoughtful approach. It was subsequently amended, and as William has said, it was very, very widely supported in the Senate. It was a 98-0 vote. So this was not a controversial piece of legislation. IRFA, as enacted, purports to make religious freedom a central element of U.S. foreign policy. There are congressional findings talking about the importance of this. Going maybe to Elizabeth's point, they talk about religious freedom undergirding the very origin and existence of the United States. So there is that element that there is something uniquely, that the United States is perhaps uniquely well positioned to advocate for religious freedom. It evokes the Universal Declaration and the ICCPR, and it notes the congressional findings that more than 1/2 the world's population lives under regimes that severely restrict or prohibit the freedom of their citizens to study, believe, observe, and freely practice their religion. I won't go through all the findings of the act, but the idea was somehow we would elevate religious freedom to a separate vector, if you like. That is, that the United States would, of course, conduct foreign policy looking at economic and security interests and all sorts of things, but that religious freedom would really be a separate consideration when thinking about how the United States should use its foreign policy tools. Now, IRFA established a series of mechanisms. It established the Office of International Religious Freedom within the State Department under an ambassador at large. The current ambassador is Rabbi David Saperstein. Second, the State Department, who I had a commissioner tell me was the enemy when I served on the commission. The State Department was charged with preparing an annual report that assessed the level of religious freedom in every country in the world and identifies countries of particular concern known as CPCs, in which the government has engaged or tolerated particularly severe violations of religious freedom. And third, a separate bipartisan commission was established to make independent recommendations to the President and the State Department concerning issues of international religious freedom, and that's USCIRF, that's the commission I sat on. The United States Commission for International Religious Freedom has 9 members. 3 are appointed by the White House, 3 by the House, and 3 by the Senate. It's done under a formula in which 5 are appointed by the President's party and 4 by the other party. So I was appointed in 2001 by Congressman Gebhardt, and so there were 4 in our party, and there were 5 in the other party. And I can tell you that I learned through great difficulty what it's like to be the member of a minority when you're trying to get things done. But it's interesting, right? It's this 5-4 split, and now, of course, the 5-4 is the other way. The ambassador at large serves as an ex officio non-voting commissioner. So USCIRF takes the position that CPC, this country of particular concern designation, can bring about changes in the target country. Thus, it's been increasing the number of countries given that designation considerably over the past 15 years. I served from 2001 to 2003. USCIRF has now about 15 years of experience. The State Department, on the other hand, takes the opposite view. The State Department rarely designates countries as CPCs and does not tend to attach specific IRFA sanctions when it does. Vietnam is an example. The Commission designated it a CPC. It was removed by the State Department when it agreed to take certain steps to ensure religious freedom. The State Department lifted the CPC designation. The Commission did not. There's also the work of, well, I think I'm going to skip that. One feature that USCIRF has added since my time at the Commission, which I think is very interesting, is it compiles prisoner of lists. It sort of has a prisoner of conscience type of advocacy. And that I actually think is very, very useful, more useful than the CPC designation, because the CPC designation, if you go look at the annual reports of the Commission, then they'll make recommendations. The US government should do X, it should do Y, it should do this, it should do that, in terms of sanctioning the country. And since the State Department doesn't like it, and the president doesn't want his hand tied by the commission. It's not very useful. But the prisoner of conscience idea, I think, is very interesting. There's also the opportunity to say that individuals who are asking for visas to the United States should be denied as such if they've engaged in particularly egregious violations of religious freedom. And this did happen against the state minister of the Indian state of Gujarat, Narendra Modi, who was involved in the attack on Muslims, actually, in Gujarat, which was there. So let me skip as we're getting close to time. This year, as I said, USERF keeps adding more and more states to the list. I think there's 16 on the CPC list now, and another 10 on what they call a watch list, Tier 2. Okay. When I joined the commission, I was a little bit on the fence about the utility of sort of having an entity that only looked at religious freedom. USERF notes that the right to religious freedom is intimately integrated with other rights, right? Which is really Elizabeth's point. And so when you read the policy recommendation of the commission, they don't focus on the whole picture. They just single out the religious freedom issues, which I think is a problem. It weakens the policy prescriptions, and it makes advocacy more difficult. Why do I say that? I did a mission to France. The commission was incensed about anti-Semitism and the French anti-cult law. And the difficulty is when I went into the meeting to talk about religious freedom issues, my French interlocutor said, what about the death penalty in Guantanamo Bay? Well, I couldn't really say much. We're a death penalty country with a severe death row issue. Many European states, most won't extradite to the United States without assurances that we won't apply capital punishment. And Guantanamo Bay had just been opened and was deemed by really all my European colleagues, even the most conservative, as one French person said, scandaleux. Outrageous, okay? And that was a right-wing conservative that said to me. The other problem that USERF has, and this isn't USERF's problem, but it's an American problem, is we don't ratify the human rights conventions. So the United States has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It has not ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. It has entered a declaration appended to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It says it's non-self-executing in the United States, meaning that Americans cannot benefit from its provisions in U.S. courts, and it hasn't ratified the optional protocol. So that's why, as a human rights lawyer, I'm sitting there thinking, well, yeah, the U.S. does pretty well on religious freedom. I appreciate that. I come from a family that's very mixed in terms of its faith, and I do know that in this country, I am very lucky to live here, that my father fled Syria, okay, as a refugee many, many years ago. And I know that the U.S. does better domestically, but internationally, it's pretty hard to advocate for one human right when the U.S. won't ratify all the human rights instruments. And it's a huge issue, not just with respect to USERF, but with every single human rights kind of thing we do. Second, and I only have a few of these, USERF is a lay commission. I think I'm pretty smart, but I don't have training in foreign policy and diplomacy and international affairs, and I'm an international lawyer. So you had a rabbi, a Catholic priest, a Protestant priest, the leader of the Baha'i faith. I can't remember who else was on the commission my year. The year before it was John Bolton, and it was good that we were not on the commission at the same time because the fur would have flown. But you got a bunch of lay people on this commission saying basically the State Department is the enemy. The State Department is too secular. The State Department doesn't take religious freedom seriously. We do. And obviously, I think that is one of the things that has hurt the commission, even though the people on it are super talented and very dedicated. And I will say one coda to that. I served during the 9/11 attacks, and the commission met with Richard Haas, all the main principals in the Bush administration, to try to argue that human rights should have been part of the agenda in the response to the 9/11 attacks, and we were one of the only government entities that was really advocating that way. And the commissioners were very, very united in that human rights had to be front and center, and not just religious freedom, but all human rights. USERF is also a bit of a lone wolf, which makes it difficult for it to be effective. 1 minute. One rarely sees recommendation for actions before United Nations bodies. Part of this is the same problem we have everywhere else. But in the USURF recommendations on Sudan this year, not a mention of the fact that it's a case before the International Criminal Court, right? So USURF sort of sees itself in this kind of insular, and the United States does more generally. It's unfortunately not always a team player. Fourth, the Commission tends, as I said, to become increasingly aggressive, sort of more is better. We keep naming and shaming, and I'm not sure that that's highly effective because less could be more. And finally, I think, and I didn't know about the lawsuit in 2012, but I do think that there has been an issue that has been ongoing and systematic at USURF about whether or not Muslims are getting the same traction as other religions. I note if you read the 2015 report, it's actually very good. Lots of cases are cited in which it's Muslim on Muslim persecution, Christian on Muslim persecution. The big gaping hole, honestly, no mention of Israel. The only time when they did a study on the, quote, Middle East, even though in Israel, interfaith marriage is prohibited, right? Which is a religious freedom issue. And Leila al-Mariyati dissented from the Commission's refusal in 2001 to say anything about the situation with respect to Israel and the occupied territories. And 2001 was the last time it was even mentioned in a Commission report. And I do think, like so many other issues in the United States, that has weakened USURF's advocacy. That said, I look forward to your questions. I think it's an interesting venture, and we should all care about religious freedom because it's really important. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. In the interest of time, I just want to pose one question for us to consider as a panel. Dr. Hurd, you discussed the challenges of defining religion and the challenges of calling out religion as a category for protection in international law. I wondered if you as a panel could reflect on the evolution of even thinking about religion as a category in diplomacy, in international law. You gave us a good overview of how we have used, how it's actually been implemented, but thinking about the definitions of religion. So if you could perhaps respond to that, or even just respond to some of the remarks you made during your talks.
I would just
interject, just to remind you to please talk into the mic.
into the mic, no problem. Yeah, no problem. I would just say that I think the problem is that we spend our time trying to define religion, and that what we actually need to think about is a much broader field of play. I think that this idea that we're going to be able to identify and settle on or establish some kind of consensus, whether it's overlapping consensus or whatever term you like, is sort of beside the point. And what I'm trying to point out in my own work is that the politics of these questions and the complex histories and the questions of institutions and authority are much too big to ever make it possible to settle on a definition of religion. And that when we try to define religion, when we do define religion, as we've seen, whether it's the Genocide Convention, as Leila was talking about, or USURF, or religious studies scholars, or your uncle around the Thanksgiving table, whoever's got it there, everyone's got their definition to proffer. I think that we are actually engaging in a particular set of persuasive discourses that can be very interesting and certainly very important and relevant to a lot of conversations. But when it comes to governance, my point is that I think it is impossible, and that it is going to inevitably be a definition that is, in its very nature, exclusionary of some and inclusionary of others. So that's a very brief answer to a very large and challenging question. Thank you.
All right, so a lot of Beth's comments really resonated with me in some very practical ways, because I was thinking back when I was a very young congressional staffer, just hadn't gone to graduate school yet, hadn't encountered the sophistication of these issues in the academic realm, but practically, I was, 22 years old. I'd been at my desk for a couple of months, and I started getting these urgent, outraged faxes. This was before email. For any of you younger people here, yes, such a time did exist. So this is back when the fax was a big thing, and all the human rights and religious freedom groups had their fax networks, and when there'd be a prisoner case, a human rights case come up, they'd alert the fax network in the Hill. So all these faxes are coming across about if I remember the details, a Pakistani Christian in some village in Pakistan who'd been arrested and was potentially going to be facing imprisonment or even the death penalty, and was going to be appearing before a Muslim judge the next day, and urgent need to intervene. And Pakistan, as many of you probably know very well, does have some very severe religious intolerance and religious freedom and religious persecution issues, and so such cases are not unfamiliar. But as I started looking into it and making some calling over to state and making contacts, you want to verify this, what's going on, and realized, well, what it really was is some combination of the guy who'd been arrested had been trying to date a girl that his parents didn't approve of, and then he had stolen the goat of the father of the girl he was trying to date. And so he'd been arrested for stealing a goat and disturbing village harmony. And he happened to be a Christian, and a number of the others happened to be Muslim. And so on the one hand, a simple reading of the facts are, yes, a Pakistani Christian was arrested and was being prosecuted by some Islamic judicial authorities, but it was not because of his religious identity at all. And I could rattle off, that was somewhat of a trifling example. He later served some time and was not executed, which would be, grossly disproportionate, of course, for stealing a goat. But I could give you countless examples of that from all over the world where religious identity is layered, not just layered on top of, but deeply intertwined with other identities, economic identity, tribal identity, ethnic identity. And disentangling that can be hard and not just hard, sometimes impossible. And what does it mean for diplomacy? But let me say this. That in my experience, the problem was not that the American government paid too much attention to religion. It was trying to religiousize everything that it saw out there. But if anything, one voice we haven't had in the conference today, this is not a criticism at all, is sort of the voice of religious minorities overseas who are dealing with a lot of this in much more gripping ways than we hear. What I was seeing overwhelmingly is complaints that the American government completely ignores religion and ignores religious freedom. And we were hearing from lots of people saying, look, your government is concerned with economic conditions or security conditions or any number of other issues here, but they don't pay attention to the most important thing about me, which is my faith, my religious identity. And so giving voice to religious believers around the world for whom their religious identity, their faith, is the most important part of their identity, and they know they have other identities too. But they felt like, in some ways, this concern is this an imposition of American religious beliefs on the world. Actually, what was in fact going on with our diplomacy, it was a strange de facto imposition of the Establishment Clause in the rest of the world, which is that we will completely ignore your religion. We will act like your religion doesn't exist at all because we have separation of church and state here, and we're going to apply that same template to our foreign policy. Well, that's one way of doing things, but it was completely missing out on a lot of voices around the world and a lot of interesting currents going on around the world religiously. I'll say all that, and I still can't give you a definition of religion. To invoke Potter Stewart's acting phrase, sometimes you know it when you see it. I mean, we can be a little more sophisticated there, but I do find there are a lot of hard cases, but at the end of the day, 90-95% of the time, you can pretty much tell is this religious or not.
I'm going to duck the question as well, and you know that lawyers don't like to answer questions that they can't answer, so I'm going to give myself my own question, which is really, what is the utility of looking at religion? Again, I'm taking a practical perspective, and I can tell you that, as I said, I was a reluctant convert to the USERF project. I didn't even believe it when Congressman Gebhardt called me. I was like, really? Like me? And then I thought about it, and I can tell you one example really turned me around and suggested to me that this could be a useful way to bring the human rights perspective, with all its flaws, as I've mentioned, to American foreign policy, and that was Sudan. Because it was evangelicals, actually, who really cared about what was going on in Sudan. Nobody else in the government actually cared about what was going on in Sudan, and a genocide was taking place in Sudan. And we managed to even get the word genocide into the Commission's report during my tenure there, to say that there are legal obligations to do something when there is a genocide taking place in another country. Because for the most part, Americans, our hearts are in the right place, sort of, but we don't really care. And with, 4% of the world's population, but sucking up about 25% of the world's resources, and with the largest military establishment out there that could do something about some of these problems, if the way to get Americans to care about what's happening internationally is to use the lens of religious freedom, I am a convert to that. Even with all, I absolutely agree that there are some real downsides to it. I think with respect to religious freedom, I do think you know it when you see it. Whether there are violations, at least the human rights law is not just going to go after religious freedom per se. It typically comes up where there are beatings, floggings, some kind of mistreatment, and certainly the criminal instruments only kick in where it's a widespread and systematic pattern. So to the extent that you're looking at it from the international human rights lens, it's got to be pretty significant to tip over the threshold so that international law even has a place looking at it. It's a very difficult dialogue, just as it's difficult for the United States to hear that it has human rights problems in Guantanamo Bay, and that it has some human rights problems in Ferguson and our policing practices, which were brought to the torture committee this summer in Geneva. But I do think the dialogue is useful. I think the dialogue is difficult. And I think as a practical matter, if it gets Americans to care, I'm for it.